Mirz Hashem after. I'm just going to put it on speaker view so that the Olam is able to follow that. Around 1 month before Rosh Hashanah, one of the leading poskim of our generation, as everyone knows, R Zalman Nechemia Goldberg passed away. And one vivid memory that I have when presiding over the Rabbinical Council of Victoria, I think it was in 2009, is that the only binding resolution that the RCV ever made was that all of our Rabbonim, all of our members, would encourage a non-financial halachic prenuptial agreement for couples when they get married. And the nusach of that agreement, the nusach was overseen by R Zalman Nechemia. He gave his stamp of approval on it. And obviously that was a very limited engagement that I have. And there were others on this forum who have had, Baruch Hashem, extremely active engagements with him and relationships with Rabbi Goldberg. So first and foremost, I wanted to invite Rabbi Menachem Sabach, who is a dayan on the Melbourne-based din, and a chaver, and also one of the committee members of the RCV, to share his experiences about being a musmach of Reb Zalman Nechemia. So Rabbi Sabach, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Glasman, for the Rabbonim, Rabbi Goodnick, Rabbi Ullman. I don't know why you picked me to go first, but I'll go first. I was only given 4 or 5 minutes to speak, and I think that to speak about anyone, it takes a long time, but especially a person in the caliber of R Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, who, as you mentioned, was, Gana Goinim, Sarah Torah. He was someone that all Rabbonim and Poskim around the world turned to for guidance. He would give Piskei Dinim on the most complex and intricate issues of halacha. If it was DNA, which I know Rabbi Ullman was very passionate about and had a lot of contact with him about, IVF and Biurei Yadus, endless amount of complex halachic issues. And so the fact that he was a great Gaon, a world leader, and it was a real tragedy to see him pass away just so quickly, so sudden. Within a few weeks, he just passed away. That is something that the entire world knows about. But today, given the fact that I was only allocated a few minutes, I think I want to just share my personal experience, what I had, my connection that I had with Reb Zalman Nechemia, and perhaps just take you behind, those of you who didn't know him that personally, perhaps just take you behind Chadrei Chadarim, how it was just liaising with Reb Zalman Nechemia and the connection that I had with him during my 4 times that I met him. So Baruch Hashem, I had the great schus and the great honor to meet him 12 years ago. It was a shidduch made by my Rosh Hashiva in France. He wanted me very much to receive a smicha from Reb Zalman Nechemia in Yerushalayim. And I learned all the halachas, everything that was necessary for Isur V'Heter. And he tested me in Yerushalayim. You walked into a very tsanua apartment, small apartment in Yerushalayim, Sfarim everywhere. The only thing you could see on the wall was the Ama Alama Zeichel Chorban that he had. And I sat there with him for about 15, 20 minutes. He questioned me in halacha, and the test itself was something most moving, because what they said about him was actually true. I could see that when he spoke to me about a Pischei Tshuva, Prima Godim, or Rabbi Kiva Eger, whatever it was, he just opened the sefer and put his finger straight onto the word that he was being medayik in. Literally, he didn't look for it for a second. He had, when they said he had photographic memory, he did. I just saw that 7 or 8 times on that that occurrence when I met him for my first time. At the end of the meeting, I was about to leave, and Reb Zalman Nechemia said, "Do you have a few minutes?" He asked me if I was rushing. He asked me if I was rushing. I said, "No, of course I have a few minutes." And he sat down with me for about 15 minutes and guided me in halacha. He said, "I want to give you practical guidance how to learn halacha, how to learn Shulchan Aruch, what it means, Torah Sapsak." And I remember then he was telling me, he can't believe that Rabbonim and Rashi Yeshivas, they think that to properly learn Shulchan Aruch, you need to learn Tur Bes Yosef first and then learn Shulchan Aruch. Little do they realize that you can't fully understand a Sif in Shulchan Aruch if you don't open the Rosh, the Rif, the Ran, and learn the Gemara with the Rishonim. And he was very strong about that. And he sat there with me for about 15, 20 minutes, giving me guidance in Shulchan Aruch, giving me guidance in halacha. And then I finished the meeting with him, and I got up with my smicha and I walked out. And as I made my way out of the room, I remember having this feeling, saying to myself, wow, what a man, what a giant of a man. When will I ever see a person like this again? I had no idea if I was going to be coming back to Yerushalayim to see him again. But all of a sudden I have this feeling, I want to see his face just one last time. And I turned around to the table where he was sitting. I was already halfway out of the door. And what I saw will remain with me forever. He sat there with the Shulchan Aruch closed in front of him, his eyes closed, and I saw his lips were moving. His lips were moving. 3 seconds after we had finished discussing, he was already back to learning. In other words, I was able to appreciate how valuable his time was. And despite that, he was able to make time for me to be able to sit and guide a young rabbi from across the world, a person who he never saw and would possibly never see again. And for me, that was really a moving experience. The second time I met him, it was 4 years later when I decided that I wanted to learn as part of R Zalman Nechemia's Dionis program. And I wanted to know which halachas would be necessary to learn as part of the program. So we were in Eretz Yisrael. We had a chasana in Eretz Yisrael at the time, and I decided I'll go to R Zalman Nechemia and speak to him and ask him what he wants for his Dionis program. I walked into his room. He didn't have any secretaries. He just answered the door. I walked in, and we sat down. I started talking, and I told him that I wanted to join his Dionis program. He didn't have to tell me anything. He just pulled out papers. He had papers in his drawers for, if you want to get tested on Niddah, these are the simonim. You want to get tested on, Issa V'Heter, Dionis, these are the simonim. He pulled out 4 or 5 papers from his drawer. He put them together, said, here, those are the simonim you need to learn them, come back, and I'll test you. I flipped through very quickly at the piece of paper that he had just given me, and I realized that in the section of Even Ezer, he had included Siman Yud Zayin, which is Hilchas Agunas, one of the most complicated halachas there at the beginning of Even Ezer. Now, I was not so keen on learning Siman Yud Zayin, especially due to the fact that I knew that R Zalman Nechemia had a psak that he paskined a bit after the September 11th, where he was matir 8 Agunas from the World Trade Center. And he actually came to a psak din where he said that DNA has the halachic requirement or hagdara as a siman muvak b'yoser. It's the best type of siman. There are 3 simonim that the Shulchan Aruch speaks about. And he said that DNA in halacha is considered siman muvak b'yoser. So I said to him, R Zalman Nechemia, the entire siman Yud Zayin, the majority of it speaks about someone who's mushlach in one place or another and trying to ascertain whether the begadim, the clothes, are actually that person's clothes. What's the necessity of learning all these halachas when you actually, wrote a psak not long ago, which I saw? He looked at me and just smiled, and he said 3 words: lahagdil Torah ulhadira. Those 3 words costed me another year of learning. Lahagdil Torah ulhadira. So I know that as rabbis, we always strive to inspire our congregants, to inspire our members. We want them to be more passionate and involved with Yiddishkeit and Jewish practice. But the reality is you cannot inspire if you're not inspired. And you cannot be an inspired Jew without being kovei itim for limud HaTorah, and particularly for Dvar Hashem, zu halacha. And I know that it's easier said than done, and especially as a pulpit rabbi, very often you're juggling so many responsibilities at the same time. But I do believe that even just being kovei itim and taking on small steps, whether it's 20 minutes a day or 30 minutes a day in practical halacha, learning halacha properly, we can achieve great heights. This is what R Zalman Nechemia's mission statement was. This was his raison d'être. He didn't just spend time learning for himself, sitting in Yerushalayim in his home, learning on his own. He spent his time going out and inspiring younger Talmidim, young Rabbonim, Rosh Yeshivas, so that they in turn could go and inspire others in Limud HaTorah. We may have never known each other before, but what united us at that point was Limud HaTorah. And that's what I took from my experience with R Zalman Nechemia. Regarding such a person in the caliber of R Zalman Nechemia, the Gemara tells us in Ksubis, Daf Nun, V'tzidkoso yomedes lo'ad, his righteousness will live on forever. Zeh halomed Torah malamda la'acherim. When someone learns Torah and makes sure not just to learn for himself, but to inspire others, this person's righteousness, his name will remain forever. In his memory, let's all take upon ourselves to learn extra halacha, practical halacha, and to guide and to teach the people around us who are so thirsty for Torah. And by doing so, we will help achieve his mission and ultimately our mission, which is lahagdil Torah ul hadira. Thank you.
Yasher Koyach, Rabbi Sabach, thank you very much for that personal insights and the Divrei Orus, which is very beautiful.
Thank you.
I'd now like to invite Rabbi Mordechai Gutnick, who is, of course, the Av based in of his insights into the man that we are honoring today. Rabbi Gutnick.
Rabbi Sabach, I envy you the fact that you had, even for only 4 visits, but nevertheless you had such an opportunity to be able to speak ponim el ponim with Harav Goldberg. I didn't meet him personally. I did sort of, as I'll mention in a moment, but I have had the opportunity, obviously, of discussing certain inyonim, certain questions by telephone with people who are close to him, and asked on my behalf, and in writing as well. But Zalman Nechemia Goldberg was known throughout the world, throughout the Torah world, as a bridge that united everyone. Everyone who believed in and loved Torah, he united them. Whether it was a Litvische Lamden, or whether it was Chabad students in Torah Emes, or whether it was Yidden from the old Yishuv, or alongside Hesder Yeshiva students and so on, any Jew who wanted to learn was invited with pleasure. And you didn't even have to make an appointment. You knocked on the door. Well, maybe you had to make an appointment, but you knocked on the door. There were no shamoshim, there was no secretary and so on, and you were able to gain entrance to him. I first saw him when I didn't realize who he actually was. Back in the 70s, I was told by the Rebbe that when I was first coming to learn in New York, I was told by the Rebbe to go via Eretz Yisrael to visit my sister and my brother-in-law, who were then in Kollel in Kfar Chabad, but they had moved to Nachlas HaChabad to establish a Kollel there. A lot of Russian Jews had come to live in that area, and the Rebbe said that the Jungerlites should go there and strengthen them and help them, but at the same time they shouldn't give up their learning, so they established a Kollel in Nachlas HaChabad. One of the guests, I don't think it was a Rosh Kollel at the time. There wasn't, I don't think, a Rosh Kollel. Later on, Rav Yaroslavsky became the Rav of the town. But one of the guest speakers that came was Reb Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, who came because he had heard, where he was living probably in Shikun Chabad in Yerushalayim, he had heard that there was a new Kollel, Chabad Kollel, that had started in Nachlas HaChabad, and they needed a bit of chizuk. And he came and he gave not just one shiur, he gave a number of shiurim in those particular years. So I didn't realize who he was at the time, but at the same time, I happened to see him. Maybe it was the years before he became very popular, back in the 70s. I don't know what his stand was at that particular time. But one of the hallmarks of him, of Reb Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, was the fact that he was accessible to so many different people, advice and counsel, mentorship, and so on. He was legendary for conferring numerous smichas upon students who would take up his smicha examinations. Hundreds and hundreds of students received smicha from him. And in this sense, he was a strong believer in the democratic aspect of Torah, that kol haretz likach yova v'yikach. Whoever wants to come can come along and take. One of the people who was involved in his testing system explained, I read, that he had an organized method about what was important in halachic subjects that each Rav has to know. He was known as an expert in guiding Rabbonim on what to focus for their particular situation, and what they could skip or learn quickly, and where to invest their energies. He tested people on various subjects. It was interesting that he was fairly unique in the fact that he gave smicha not necessarily on the normal things that smicha was given for, but if he took a certain subject, he would give smicha on that particular subject. And I saw that his son wrote once that they were once sitting and they saw he was writing a smicha for someone who had learned a few simonim in Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. And when they asked him what it was about, he explained that this Jew had been chosen to serve as a rav in a remote town in the Soviet Union. And the only halachic question that would be presented to him would probably be about what time to light a Yotzeit candle. And so therefore it was important to me, R Zalman Nechemia said, that he should learn a few simonim about basic principles of Yiddishkeit, and at least he should know those before he goes. He was a Talmud Chacham that was par excellence. He had a phenomenal memory. They say, as Rabbi Sabach pointed out, he had a photographic memory. He took over the editorship of the Encyclopedia Talmudis. But I think the most thing that he was renowned for was he was the world's foremost expert on Even Ezer and Choshen Mishpat. Sections of Shulchan Aruch dealing with family law and dealing with commercial law. He was an extraordinary creative thinker, and it wasn't just necessarily in being able to manipulate the halachic sources, but in common sense as well. And his rulings and practices impact on Botei Dinim worldwide. One subject that Rabbi Sabach touched on that really we actually discussed this morning in the Beis Din was his tshuva on the agunis of the World Trade Center of 9/11. And one point that he raises there, amongst the many others that he brings to try and find heterim for the people who needed a heter in those circumstances, was this DNA question that Rabbi Sabach talked about. I know this is an issue that Rabbi Ullman is very much involved in, and I'm not going to go into great detail. I'll leave that for him if that's a topic he wants to broach. But the tshuva that he wrote at that particular time had a very interesting point in the middle of it, where he talks about the Bedikas DNA, about DNA being considered as a siman mufuk, so to speak, to enable us to be able to identify somebody who virtually there was no other way of identifying them. People who were lost in the towers. Sometimes absolutely nothing was left. Sometimes maybe a few bones were left, but sometimes DNA was found. And the R Zalman Nechemia was very strong in allowing that DNA to be considered as a siman mufik. He talks about the concept of whether DNA is something that is recognized as being foolproof. And he says that, literally that scientists say that one in many billions of people could possibly have the same DNA. And some people questioned him on this basis, but you don't know for sure. Even with DNA, you don't know for sure. And he said he brings down in his tshuva, he brings down many things such as tvias ayin, bekalim, that if you just see something, even if you don't know for sure, we always, when we're giving the get, and we ask the Eidim and we ask the Sefer, do you have a siman mufuk? Do you have a siman that this is the get that you that you wrote and that you were Eidim on? And they have a siman. They usually make a few dots, pinholes in the top or something else like that. And yet we don't ask them what size were the dots, how were they spaced mamish differently apart, and so on. Instead, they say there's 5 dots there, and that was a tvias ayin that was considered sufficient. So even if you don't get 100% accuracy, but there is a tvias ayin, there is an ability to be able to say api halacha that this is a siman mufuk, then it becomes a siman mufuk. In many areas like that, you find, as far as the halachas of treifus are concerned, Chacham said the rov behemus ksheris. We wouldn't be able to drink milk otherwise. Otherwise, if the cow had some sort of internal deficiency and could be considered treif, if you shechted it, you shouldn't be able to drink the milk. So why are you allowed to drink milk without checking the cow to see if it's a treif or not, if it's going to die within the next year? And we say that the rov behemus ksheris, the majority of behemoths are kosher. That means even if not all the animals in the world are kosher, but rov behemus ksheris is considered good enough. So definitely, in the case of DNA, where you're talking about 1 in billions, that should be considered sufficient. So he finishes off that part of the tshuva by saying, Al kolponim gam ha'havdelim hamiskalim b'bdikas DNA This is something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made, just like behemoths. Most behemoths are considered kosher. Same thing also with regard to human beings. HaKadosh Baruch Hu made each one considered as being different, each one having different DNA. And so therefore, even if you can't tell exactly, I mean, again, if we're dealing with Gittin, as we were this morning, when you have to check the witnesses' signatures and know that this is the signature of this particular witness and so on, you don't have to look and know perfectly. A Tviyas Ayin is good enough. Just it has to be a strong approximation, but approximation is good enough. And so therefore, on this basis, he ruled. I'm being very simplistic about it. There's a lot more to it. But in this basis, he ruled that DNA would be considered good enough. Now, that's not only with regard to the people who were in the World Trade Center. This is with regard to, as Rabbi Ullman can testify, with regard to DNA being used for Biru Yahadus or for other purposes and so on. He set an example about the importance and about how we can, in most circumstances, not in all, we can rely on DNA. So his psukim were not, and not necessarily were they all, as I said, lomdas. They were just common sense, and his psukim were wonderful in that particular regard. I mean, in general, he was very, very involved in being Mati Agunis, as we saw with the World Trade Center, but in general, and he actually made the Israeli police change their policies about identifying victims of car crashes to be more suitable, to make sure that the person who was identified and was killed was actually that particular individual who they said it was. And he said, and he made sure that the whole police system changed to fit more like the army. In the army, they allowed on looking at X-rays of teeth and so on, of records that the dentists have. That was considered, again, very, very meaningful for him, and I suppose of the concept of Tviyas Ayin, of knowing that this is this particular individual. So he actually made them upgrade their standards. And in general, he was very, very involved in this whole concept of agunas. He was famed for his creative solutions for permitting agunas whose husbands had remained behind in the Soviet Union to allow them to marry and so on. And it was in this area that I had a personal contact with him in one particular occasion. We had here in Melbourne a young lady who got married, and the day that after she was married, her husband had a massive heart attack and he died. And it was a tragedy. It was a terrible tragedy, but it was compounded a year or so later on when she found another man. She wanted to marry this other man. And she came to a particular Rav in our town, who's no longer with us, no longer here in Melbourne, he's no longer with us generally, but he came to that particular Rav and said, I want you to marry me. And he went through the paperwork, and Baruch Hashem, he did a good job. And he said to her, I've got a problem. Your husband died a day after the wedding, and he's got a brother. So we have to do a chalitza here. We have to make sure that your husband's brother gives you chalitza. Otherwise, you can't marry anybody else. So he called in the brother, and B'shumai from the brother didn't want to be involved. There were reasons for it. He had his reasons. There was no way he's going to give chalitza. They threatened all sorts of things and so on. No way he's going to give chalitza. So we didn't know what to do. So he came to me and he said, what should we do? So I said, look, I suggest that we right away and we ask, maybe we can find some sort of heter. We take all the circumstances and we send it to a godel. And we chose R Zalman Nechemia Goldberg because he was the one who was known to be involved with agunas and things like that. And we sent him a letter. We told him what was going on. He answered almost immediately. And he said, I want to know if she knew that he had any problem, or if he knew even that he had any problem before the marriage, that all of a sudden he should die after the excitement of the marriage, and maybe the marital, I don't know what it was, but he died the next day with a massive heart attack. Was there any way in which he knew or she knew about his propensity for, and it turned out, I already started to think already, I think I know where this is leading to. So we asked questions, and it turned out that he knew that he had a very, very severe problem with his heart, but he never told her, and she didn't know. And we wrote this to R Zalman Nechemia, and we said to him, yes, he knew, he was under special treatment and so on, but she didn't know. So he came back quick as a flash, and he said, if that's the case, we can build up a heter on the grounds of mekach tos. That if she would have known that this guy couldn't live a normal life, couldn't father children because of his heart condition and so on, and zestach, what happened immediately afterwards, he got a massive heart attack, would she have married him? So he said, if that's the case, then the Kiddushin is bottled, and if that's the case, she doesn't need chalitza, and you can go ahead and marry her. So I heard this is a big chiddush. I mean, to rely on this on being mevatel the Kiddushin. So I said to him, I wrote to him, and I said to him, could I get from the Rav in writing? I want to be able to have on record that this is the way it was paskin. He wouldn't give me the answer in writing. At that particular time, there was a lot of controversy that was going on with regard to hefkeres of Kiddushin, of being mafkia Kiddushin and so on. And he maybe he was worried about the fact that he would be quoted and incorrectly and so on. So he didn't want to put in writing that he'd given a heter being based on the fact that he was mevatel the Kiddushin. But he did tell me there is, however, a bezdin that I can recommend for you, a choshev bezdin. And if you contact them, and if you tell them what I have said, you'll probably be able to get from them an official tshuva in writing. And I did. I contacted that bezdin as soon as they heard what I'd said in the name of R Zalman Nechemia. I don't know whether they did their own research and called him as well to find out. But a week later, I had in my hand a heter from the whole bezdin, signed in giving over this particular tshuva and allowing this young lady to get married again. And Baruch Hashem, she's now got a family and she's now very happy. And this was because of R Zalman Nechemia's ability to be able to take what he felt was so important of being matir agunis, if possible, and to give us the wherewithal to be able to be matir this aguna all the way in Australia somewhere, who really didn't have any shaykhs with whatsoever. He didn't even have a shaykhs with us as rabbonim. We just happened to choose him as being the pesach for this particular circumstance. But this was the type of person that R Zalman Nechemia Goldberg was. I read that at the Shiva house for R Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, somebody wrote a description and said they saw a full spectrum of visitors. They saw a Hasidic rabbi with 3 escorts, mingling with a Sephardic dayan, a Litvischer Rosh Yeshiva, a Rav of a Moshav with a knitted kupa sruga, a knitted yarmulke, crowding in alongside men in striped Yerushalmi kapotes, and even a professor was there with a cap and with a notebook, and he was taking notes and he was telling over certain things. The crowd was I think the word is heterogeneous. It was a total mixture of people, but it was appropriate, and it was a reflection of R Zalman Nechemia, the way he lived and the way he was a teacher and the way he was a pesach to so many of us. He's going to be missed by many of us because he was accessible. You didn't have to make appointments. He was accessible to answer, and as best as he could, he would answer as soon as he could. And he's going to be very missed. And I just like to say that he's Zichrei Baruch, may his memory be blessed, and may his teaching still continue to guide us. I know this question of the DNA is something that really is on my agenda at the moment now. And as I said, I know that Rabbi Ullman is very, very much involved in this particular question. And there are so many other questions. And may he still continue to guide us, even yatim b'chayayu, even more so than when he was alive. Yehi zichrei baruch.
Thank you, Rabbi Gutnick, for those words which were most fitting and most appropriate. Yasher koyach. And finally, I'd like to invite Rabbi Ullman, who's a senior dayan in the Sydney-based inn, and who I believe had a very long-standing and close relationship as a Talmud with Rabbi Goldberg, to share his insights now.
Rabbi Isa, first of all, Yasher koyach to Rabbi Glassman, who organized this particular gathering in honor of Rav Goldberg. I want to thank the 2 speakers, Rav Mordechai Gutnick and Rav Menachem Sabach, who spoke so fittingly about him. I felt after R Zalman Nechemia passed away, I felt a great feeling of guilt because his shleishim coincided with Rosh Hashanah, and I always felt that we shouldn't have a situation what the Chazal say, the Talmid Chacham shel nisbat kehalocha. And who am I and what am I to say that it's going to be kehalocha? Definitely won't be kehalocha, whatever I'm going to say. But I would like to share some of the things that, both personal and otherwise, of the relationship which I was able to have with R Zalman Nechemia. The relationship began just under 30 years ago. I was in Eretz Yisrael specifically to meet, because at that point it was already Kimitzir and Teita Seira, the center of Psak Halacha, of knowledge. It was in Eretz Yisrael, and I wanted to get to know the Gdolei HaPoskim, and Zalman Nechemia already had a name that he was Bereishon, and to begin a relationship with them so we can be able to discuss and talk and ask for guidance and direction in this inyonim. The first time I've met with him was in a kollel by the Sadigera Hasidim, where he was the Rosh HaKollel for many years, and that's how it began. And since then, every single time that I went to Eretz Yisrael, which was on a yearly basis, we met at least once. And on top of it, I was able to receive many tshuvas and letters and even phone calls, which I will come to. And throughout our meetings, I also had a glimpse into, he never liked to speak about himself. And whenever he spoke about himself, it was mainly to do with somebody in his family, to do with his parents. But I was able to put together certain things, and I also became very friendly for many, many years with his son of Aaron, who was the one that put together Mincha Shleim of his Zeder, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and also responsible for putting together, hopefully from Zalman Nechemia, he could write literally probably hundreds of volumes of things that he wrote over the years, which hopefully will see light of day one day. Just to say that Zalman Nechemia was the last of his kind. I think in English there's a term, I think they call it the last of the Mohicans, as expression. There's nobody else like this today that from old generation who was born in the city of Minsk in Russia. His father was a great Rav, Avram Goldberg, who was a Rav who was sent to Siberia, who was very close to the Moshe Feinstein, to many other Gdolei Yisrael. While he was in Siberia, the mother, I mean, I won't tell the whole story, what type of life as a kid he had, without a home, without food. Finally, when his father came out from Siberia, they were able to move to Riga with the help of Mordechai Dubin, Zecher Tzadik Levrocha. And they lived in Riga for a few years. His father was a world Maggid. He was a Maggid of the world. He was like, you don't have this Maggidim today. And he was unknown yet to most people. And he was asked to do a hesped for a certain person called Rav Kaddish. And after talking to the family for half an hour, he gave the most unbelievable hesped and asked him to become Rov and Maggid in Riga. And that's what happened. And that's how Zalman Nechemia, as a young child, lived in Riga for a few years. And that's when they met the Rogachover. I mean, how many people today, he was the last person alive who saw the Rogachover many times. The Rogachover, who lived in a city, everybody knows, the Saratoga. The Rogachover was the legendary giant of not just of his generation, of many generations. And he was the Hasidic Rov in Dvinsk. There were two Rabbonim. And he used to go to Riga to rest because Riga was next to the ocean. And Zalman Nechemia, as a young child, would go together with his father on a daily walks with the Rogachover. And this in itself is something which he still remembers, the nigun with which the Rogachover learned. I mean, it sounds like he remembers himself from the age of 2. That's what it sounds like, even though he never told me that, but it just when you put things together. Zalman Nechemia once told me, I want to say that people talk about his humility. I believe that his humility is on a different level altogether to anybody else I met, because usually when people are humble, they're humble because they really work on the midas and everything else. With him, he didn't understand the cloud, what it means humility. He didn't know there was any other way. He never ever looked at anybody as not an equal. And I'll tell you soon about the kind of conversations that he had with us. And I recently spoke to a very close friend of mine who also was zocher to be very close to Zalman Nechemia, and we compared notes how he spoke to people that he discussed learning and Torah with. But Zalman Nechemia once, by accident, spilled the beans, so to speak. He was talking about 2 of his uncles, One of his uncles was a choizer by the Rebbe Rashab, and the other one was a very close chosed of the Frierdiker Rebbe. And he told me that in the schus of his uncle, when he was maybe 6 years old, he knew the whole Zroim like Asher Shevisecha. He didn't say those words, but that's what he said. And when he said it, he right away became a bit red in his face because he didn't intend to talk about himself. He was talking more about his uncle's influence, his uncles, because there was a mitzvah of Mishnayos and so on and so forth. But it's a known fact that but before his bar mitzvah, he was Boki Baal Peh in all Shisha Siddur Mishnah. And in fact, there is a letter which the Frierdiker Rebbe, which I have in my library, that the previous Rebbe wrote to his father in Tov Shin Hey when he was just bar mitzvah, and in honor of the fact that he was Boki in all Mishnayos, he says, "Sumachti b'shmoya shebnoi Mar Zalman Nechemia hitzliach betalmudei." He didn't say matzliach betalmudei; he said hitzliach betalmudei. When he was a young man, just got married, he went to get smicha from Rav Herzog, who was Rav Rosh in Eretz Yisrael. Herzog, we know he was Boki b'kol Torah Kula. Zalman Nechemia was told to get smicha from him, and Rav Herzog knew him. He knew his father very well, and he spoke to him in all of Torah, in all Dal Chelke Shulchan Aruch and Tur B'S Yosef, and then he asked him, "Do you know Bavli?" Now it's known that Zalman Nechemia knew Bavli from the age of 17. I heard from somebody who learned in Hebron. When he walked into Hebron, they pointed to him and said, "This they wanted to ready to." The Rosh Yeshiva wanted to encourage him to learn. So he said, "You see this young bocher, he knows Bavli Baal Peh." That was Zalman Nechemia. But when he was asked by Rav Herzog, "Does he know Bavli?" he couldn't lie because he knows. He says, "Yes." So he asked him, "Do you know Yerushalmi?" So he said he knew Yerushalmi Bahat also at the time, but he was embarrassed to say it. He said some Masechtas. So he told him, "Which Masechtas do you know in Yerushalmi?" So he couldn't say now. You know, the Seba Darogachova, when he was a young boy, asked him, "Do you know how much of Shas do you know?" He says, "Half of Shas." They asked him, "Which half?" He said, "Whichever one you want, any half you want." So Zalman Nechemia didn't say that, and he already told him, "I know only some Masechtas." So he told him a few Masechtas. So the smicha, and I have the copy of a smicha that he received. The smicha that he received was. It's a long smicha that he received, and he says, talks about his knowledge in the whole of Halacha, Shulchan Aruch, Tur, and he says, "Boki b'chol Talmud Bavli u'bechelik b'Talmud Yerushalmi." That's part of the smicha. So he went home and he showed the smicha to his father, and his father really got angry with him. He says, "Why did you have to lie and say that you only know part of Yerushalmi? You have to be humble now in your smicha. It says you only know chelik of Yerushalmi, you know the whole Yerushalmi." That was the story. But his knowledge in all of the Chazal from beginning to end, his knowledge in Rishonim, like we mentioned the Rosh, he spoke about the Rosh all the time, and you Rosh Mamash Shesiva Erev, as I say, and he also certain Achronim, Rabbi Kiva Eger, the Ktzos, Nesivas. That's something which he knew by heart. I heard a story from Kalman Ber, who was a very big Rav in Datilu Mirov, He said that he spoke to a certain Litvish Rav called Baruch Shmuel Deutsch, who was a neighbor of R Zalman Nechemia. And this Baruch Shmuel Deutsch, he belongs to a certain Litvish group that was very, very anti-Chabad. And when R Zalman Nechemia participated in one of the Siyumei Rambam, which Chabad organized, when you learn Rambam 3 prokim a day, so he went over to him and he gave him a very, very polite macho. He said, we shouldn't be going to this siyumim. So Zalman Nechemia told him, what's wrong with learning Rambam? Rambam is such an unbelievable sefer. What's wrong with learning Ala Seder? So he told him, because Rambam is not a halacha. Shulchan Aruch is the halacha. So Zalman Nechemia said to him, let's see how many times does the Shulchan Aruch was choiluk on Rambam. And he went from Orachaim to Yerodeh every single, he just went one after the other, all of the times. He wanted to show him that hardly ever the Mechaber didn't rule like the Rambam. So he went through all the times from Orachaim to Choshen Mishpat, the few times that he saw the Mechaber was choiluk, just to show him. But generally speaking, when you spoke to Zalman Nechemia, he was a person that was completely nicht gehalten von sich. He was a person that completely didn't have any feeling of himself. The whole world looked at him as a Pesach. He never looked at himself as a Pesach. I must tell you that he himself, there was a very big, very difficult to get him to to Paskin. And I spoke to Rav Litko, who's a very close friend of mine. He said exactly the same thing. He said, whenever you speak to him, you're trying to get a psak out of it. He says he will talk to you in learning. Because to him, practical halacha and learning were never two separate things. He believed that you go through learning, and that's how you get to the truth. And he would always say, like, no, was doctor wegen dem? What do you say about this? What do you say? And he would talk to you like he's talking to an equal. And when I would ask him, but the Rav Zal Paskinen, he would say, Ir Zal Paskinen. He said, you're the best. You should, it's your child. You should pass. I'm just talking to you, learning, and that's his style all the time. And one of the first cases that we had with Imam Zayris, and I must tell you that one of the reasons that he didn't like to mitzaref bichsav, at least not to be the first one, it wasn't because he was afraid of controversy. It wasn't because he was afraid to be revolutionary. He was, people say, was Mekel. He was, when it came to himself, he was extremely machmir. He was, whenever it came to any halacha, he would go through all of the shittas, and he would himself, I'll tell you, those who know that he wore tchelis. And because he didn't want anybody to know that he wore tchelis, he wore his tzitzis inside. He didn't want to wear it outside because, most Haredim, they wear tzitzis outside, but he didn't want anybody to see. So one time when I was by him and his tzitzis came out, I took a very discreet photo of it, which I have till today, which I'm not sharing. I'm not sending it to anybody, but it's a photo of a tchelis sticking out from his trousers. But the reason why he was very reluctant to put his name first, because he was always afraid that somebody will also mitzaref because of him. And I'll tell you, Ma'aseh Shehoya, in the very first cases, it was almost 20, maybe 28 years ago, where the interesting Imam Zayros case. And I always would write all the nimukim v'taimim, and I would show it to him. And this particular time I actually came to his house, and he's a whole koloteri kula. He would start talking about, Balbasa, comparing, stories, and he would, by him it was, I just for him, I got my Adim to buy me a special machshir before the iPhones to be able to tape the conversations, both telephone conversations and personal conversations, because he was my name is Gaber. He would go all around the koloteri kula, and then you have trouble writing it down afterwards. So I used to tape the conversations. And so he, first of all, he understood. He said, you can pass on yourself, but he understood also the desire of every person, like the Gemara says in Yevamos and Sanhedrin, that you want to be able to alleviate some of the achrayas by getting others to pass with you. So he tells me that he's happy to mitzaref, but he would like also not to be alone to mitzaref, but to be with somebody else, not with three of us. That's how he was, in his humility, that's how he put it. So I went to another very close Pesach that I'm very, very close with, Rabatzri. And I spoke to him and I gave him all my nimukim v'taimim. And Rabatzri was mitzaref bichsav. And he wrote that I was happy to see that Yedidi Hagoy and R Zalman Nechemia Goldberg was also mitzaref. So I brought it back to R Zalman Nechemia, and I said to him, now you can mitzaref. And he tells me, do you mind? He used to say it's very, very, it's the way he said things was unbelievable. He said, would you mind asking somebody else who doesn't know that I was mitzaref? That's what he said. That was his style. Michlal, the way he used to speak, I would call him up always to make time to meet with him. And he would always tell me, I don't want to matriach you. You have to come to see me. Sometimes I would come and sing twice because there was something, something I wanted him to sign or something which wasn't finished. He would say, listen, I'm embarrassed you should come. Maybe you should send somebody, send a driver. Why should you come? To me, it was an opportunity to meet with him an extra time. And he looked at it like his matriach me, that he's matriach me to come and see me. That was his style to talk. To share a interesting story. One time there was a couple, a Haredi couple, that lives in Eretz Yisrael, and they came to see him with a very, very complicated fertility shiur, which I'm not going to go into because the time is limited. And he needed really greater places to pass him. And he told them that he's agreeing to it, and he gave me a few klolim, a few different rules, including the fact that he believes they should have a get while they're going through this particular procedure. That's what he told them. And he said, and again, I didn't speak to him then. The first time is the day he called me up, and they said to me that he told them that for practical guidance, they should come to me. And that's how they called me. And of course, as soon as they called me, I agreed to do it because it wasn't anymore my chrayas. It was already, I'm riding on broad shoulders. And I called him up. And again, I didn't have my machshir with me then. So I wrote down things that he said, but he was talking about, right away, look at last Maharsha in Gittin. And look at the Tosos of Rabbi Kilda of Paris. He would tell me, things that I had to write down. And Baruch Hashem, I have most of it, but I'm sure not everything. And then we decided with this couple that we'll do everything while I'm in Eretz Yisrael. They didn't want to do a get through Rabbanut because forever they'll be recorded as a grusha. So we agreed that I would organize a get. I had the Av President of Tel Aviv. He's a close friend of mine. He told me he'll give me a sofer and aid him and everything else, and we'll organize a get. And they came to see me to discuss the protim, and every time they would mention the get, they would just burst out crying, unbelievable. So I called the R Zalman Nechemia, and I said to him, because I didn't feel there was a need for a get. It was a chumrah. And I said to him, I would never change it. It's your psak. I just want to discuss with you. He says, my psak, chas v'sholom. Who says my psak? I sent them to you. You're dealing with it. And if you feel the shuli without a get, I'm happy to agree with you. And that was his style. That he was never ever felt that he was somehow above anybody else. It was always a very, very, sometimes to his detriment. It was very, very difficult. Sometimes, most of the time, to receive any kind of Rabbi Mordechai Gutnick said how he didn't like to put these things b'chsav, and there's no question about it that he avoided it. One time over the years, Baruch Hashem, we have for him a lot of shuvas that he wrote. One time I sent him a short shuva that I wrote for him to agree about a shaila in Zikui get. It was 2-page shuva that I wrote to discuss both ways. At which point can you mizaka get? And then I get from him, in fact, a kuntras, handwritten, 12 pages. And he sends a apology to me that he apologizes that he's written such arichas and it's going to take my time. And he tells me that most of it's not halach l'maisa, most of it is it's in learning. There's one on page 8. There is a section which is to do halach l'maisa, and it was to do with trumas and maisas in shlichus, and it was an unbelievable thing which Emir Hashem will published. I retyped it. I sent it for him to be magia, and it will be Emir Hashem printed in a sefer, which I'm hoping to put out very soon. Derech Hagav, with the sefer itself, I asked him after Pesach for and by the way, when I visited him last time in November, he still taught, he still was active, 24/7, but you could see that he wasn't the same. He was weaker, he was older, he was harder for him to speak, he was speaking very softly. And I was always, after that, I was a little bit mindful, and it was more difficult to call him because I felt that maybe I'm overextending his koiches. So I asked him for a haskoma to my sefer, and he never waited. He did it immediately. I asked quite a few people, and I don't have any tightness because everybody's busy, and I think it's normal that people are busy and they take the time. And but with him, it was like immediately he sent the most beautiful haskoma, and then I get communication from his son. He says, "My father can't find himself. He is really." Upset that he thought the sefer is already being sent to print, and therefore he has to rush it. He feels that it's not bakovadik to write just haskoma. He should write something, some kind of a ha'ara on something that you wrote. And I told my father, and he told me to call up and apologize. And he says, but when the book will come out, I'm going to write something on the book itself. So I said, don't tell your father not to worry. I have, Baruch Hashem, a lot of things that he wrote. So he says, he wrote me Nochadaita. When he heard this Nochadaita, that's what he wrote. So he was a very, very unusual person. When I want to tell you that he was the only person that he was always in the sugya. As much as he never considered himself a Pesach, everyone else, no matter how great, in Israel you have a lot of great Talmidei Chachamim Poskim, but invariably, when you talk to them, you would say, listen, I hear what you're saying, I'm not on the sugya, I have to go back and refresh my refresh myself on the sugya. With him, it was never ever a case that he wasn't in the sugya. He was always we got questions of androgynous, questions of vasectomies and all kinds of shadows, which never ever he was always on the tip of his fingers. Again, not to paskening. He was when he had to, he did it. But it was but to discuss, to give direction, talk and learning, that was always the case. And one time I remember we had a very difficult case. We had a certain gentleman in our community that had a nervous breakdown, and it came impossible for his wife to continue living with him, and she wanted to get. In the beginning, he said he's going to give her a get, then he refused to give her a get. At one point, he was calling me. I had an emergency get on Erev Sukkot in my home, and he calls me up from a psychiatric clinic. By the way, he was never a shoyte, he was never beget a shoyte, but he was, shoyte has a whole different gather. And he started to talk to me about shalom bayis and about this and about that. And I said to him, listen, you must give a get. And I was talking for 1 hour, convincing him to give a get, and he was saying yes and no and yes and no. It was like a roller coaster. At one point, I said to him, "You're not a kohen. You can always marry her again. So if you refuse a get, it's only gonna destroy the relationship. If you give a get, there's a chance you might marry her again." He didn't respond. So I said to him, and you can write a kislut nu. I have a sofer and Adim in my house right now. We come to you. We could do kislut nu, and we're not gonna moiser the get until you give me the go ahead. He didn't respond. We continued to speak for another half an hour, and then he says, "You know what? Come." We came. I right away in the car prepared the kislut nu. We came. The whole team came together to the psychiatric ward. I came. He explained to him what he's saying. He appointed the sofer and the Adim and everybody else. We signed it on the way back. We came home. We wrote a get, and she came. We moiser the get. Next day, he calls me up and he says, "I hope he didn't give over the get." He tells me. I said to him, "I didn't." But when I say I didn't, in my mind, I made a palginun debura. What I meant was I didn't give her a ptur yet. So I said I didn't give her a get in the hand yet. That's what I say in my mind. I didn't want to lie to him, but I didn't want to tell him. But I said to him, "But it's just get it over and done with." So he says. So he says to me, "But you said you're not going to give a get. You said you're going to try to write kislut nu." So I wrote a psak, and then a week later he tells me, "Fine, give the get over." It was done. And then I wrote a psak and I sent it to 3 poskim, and 2 of them, they were mislabet, mehasses. Maybe taka. I said, "Listen, what I told him was bottle b'shishim." He didn't respond to it. It was my idea. It wasn't his idea. He didn't respond to the fact that I shouldn't give over the get. At the end, he said, "Come over," and he was vatal midoyos. He did all the things. He was dvorim shubalev enem dvorim. I also found that Shule in the Moshe Feinstein's last volume test, which just came out at the time, that Moshe did a similar thing even in a more difficult situation. He said to Moshe get even lifnei hamaisa, even before the husband actually agreed to do it. The husband says, "Don't give it over," and then Moshe says, "Give it over." So I told him, and I sent it to R Zalman Nechemia. He was working in Talmudic encyclopedia. That's why I could send to him emails, because at home, of course, he didn't have an email. And then he wrote to me a he wrote to me a very nice askoma that he agrees with it. And that's the time when he was able to be, as they say, very, very chad v'chalak. What Mordechai said, Rabbi Gutnik said about him being very, very careful on mekachtos, it's 100% correct. As a matter of fact, I did discuss with him the difference between a get and a chalitza, between somebody who needs to get to pater somebody from chalitza as opposed to pater somebody from a get. And but the only time that I saw that he came out of his usual, he was so respectful to everybody, as was said before me by Rabbi Gutnik and Rabbi Sabach, that he was colorblind. He didn't know which yarmulke you wore, whether it was a kippah suga or whether you were this or that. He was completely oblivious of all of that. But and he was so respectful to everybody. But one time I saw in Tchumen, he went out Yotzim Megidroi, and he wrote so sharply to a particular rov that wanted to start a whole shitta to mafkir kedushin. Whenever the husband doesn't want to give a get, and he wrote to him a very respectful letter to show him that it doesn't make sense, and the Rav wrote back to him. And then R Zalman Nechemia wrote to him, I asking you to desist from what you're doing because you are machriv kol Beit Yisrael, you're destroying the whole of the Jewish. He wrote to him in such a strong letter. That's how he felt when it came to these things. And people who didn't know him, they would talk to him in learning, and they would think that he agreed to psak halacha, and he had a whole different style. He could talk to you learning, agree to a particular shitta, but he never ever agreed to necessarily to the psak. And there was a whole controversy in Israel a few years ago when a particular dayan wrote a whole 93-page psak to allow a zikui get when the husband was a vegetable, and his wife Nebuch was stuck, and he wanted to do something which was never done before, to say that you can mizake the husband by in his absence, without his participation, to memana shliach, memana eidim, memana sofer, and everything else. And when the psak came out, the dayan, whom I know personally very well, he wrote that I have the askoma from Zalman Nechemia Goldberg. And Zalman Nechemia came out with him so sharply against this psak. And I spoke to Zalman Nechemia about it. He says, I never spoke to him halacha l'maisa. We spoke about certain areas in learning. He was able to, because he never looked at the guys coming to him for psak. He said, it's discussing learning with him. So on a certain prat, I agreed with him. It doesn't mean that I would agree to put my name on something so revolutionary and v'chulu v'chulu. With prenup, it's another interesting story. He's always quoted that he agreed on RCA prenup. And generally speaking, he did. He spoke to Rabbi Willig, and they spoke about the klolim. And Rabbi Willig says that this was done together with R Zalman Nechemia Goldberg. When I came to, I've organized a meeting with Rabbi Fegelstock. We're working on a prenup. And R Zalman Nechemia said I very humbly, he said, I agree with the prenup generally, but I think the two chesreinas on that prenup. And if you notice, he never wrote bichsav a haskama to the RCA prenup. And he said, what are his two objections to that? No objections, but he said it's not l'chol hadeis. One of them, the fact that the word get is mentioned. I think that since then they revised it, so it could be different now. But then the word get.
What's your favorite creation?
Creation.
Mm-hmm.
The word get was mentioned, and he felt it should be completely without mentioning the word get. Just talk about the fact that kol zman that you married, you have to give X amount of money every day. And the second thing was that he didn't want to use the word knas, but the words mezainas. And when we revised that particular prenup, I have his ksaviyad when he actually wrote on it that he agrees with his prenup, and he advises and he encourages that every couple should sign it before they get married. So with him, you have to be always mindful of the fact that he many times he would guide a Rav as an equal. He would talk to him in learning, but not always. The fact that he agreed means they agreed in its entirety. I want to finish off by saying there's really a lot I could say more about two more short stories. One of them was also about 17 years ago. I wrote a interesting tshuva about allowing a yichud. If you're waiting for Gimel Chod Shavchon, if you're going to wait for 3 months after Gerus, if you can allow them to live together based on the same heter as for husband and wife in Niddah. And I bought rayas from Rabbi Akiva Eger and from other places, and I sent it to him to agree with, and I never received an answer from him. And I called up, and I really wanted to get an answer from him because it was. And then I called up his wife, and she was sometimes, because he never knew how to use a fax. He never did himself. She always was his secretary who would send things for him. And after I spoke to his wife, suddenly I get a phone call from him on my Australian phone. He calls me up, and he apologized for not. He said prefers to say Baal Peh. And he started to talk Baal Peh, and I wrote everything down, and everything is recorded what he said. And he agreed with the premise, 100%. And I asked him again in Eretz Yisrael, just to make sure that it wasn't one of those cases that he agrees, and then he would say it was only. And he not only agreed, but he brought me a raya from Pilegesh, from one of the Rishonim. And then he advised us, encouraged us to use the psak of Dogel Mervova with Gerus to avoid that nisoyan for the couple to be together. And since then the couple has to convince us to give them the 3 months, 92 days between Gerus. Usually we'd tell them to take a pregnancy test and marry them as soon as possible to avoid them undermining the Gerus by chas v'sholom being nichshel and being together. And the last thing which I want to say I have a lot of akaras hatoif for him, because he he was a person that really gave a lot of time, and it was in the most beautiful way that he never made you feel like you be matriachim. And about 10 years ago, I told him that I have in Gelite, they asked me to start a Dayonis program, and I explained to him what it's and would he participate, and would he be a Rosh Hamasmichim, and he right away agreed, because to him there was nothing more important than to have Gelite learning, and he was personally involved in putting together a curriculum, and he very, very much pushed for Ebenezer. He says to me that in Choshen Mishpat, you can make a mistake, you can correct it. In Ebenezer, you make a mistake, you can correct it. And he really, really went together. Ultimately, Choshen Mishpat was also part of the program, but we went together. We put together a curriculum. He signed all the smichas, relying on it. Obviously it was difficult. It was proper testing and everything else, but he didn't want to test himself. He says he wants to rely on me, which was very, very gracious of him. I always make sure whenever we had a graduation to bring whatever chaverim could come to bring them to the Eretz Yisrael, and to personally meet with him, and he would talk to them, and he would do it with such a inspirational way. The way he was just. And one time, I always wanted him to give a shiur, and the problem was that he never had any technology in his house. It was all complicated to give a shiur. He was not a person that. So one time when I was in Eretz Yisrael, I organized for him to come to Ulpan. Ulpan is like a studio. And by the way, when he gave shiurim, many times he didn't know what shiur was going to give. He would walk into yeshiva, he would ask, what sugi are you learning? And he would give the most incredible shiur in all of the shas and poskim and rishonim archonim. And he walked in and he asked me, what would you like to hear about? I said, maybe agunas. And he spoke about agunas, and he spoke about it also from only the way that R Zalman Nechemia can speak. So I want to say that I personally feel that, sometimes you don't realize the place a certain person has in your life until you lose that person. I personally feel a tremendous, tremendous void, almost like a person that you can't anymore. Nobody can replace that. Nobody can replace that level of everything. God was in Persönlichkeit, in Torah, Kol Torah Kula, in the way that he was able to be open to everybody, like was mentioned before. And we should also, in his, there's nothing more important thing that in Gelite learning, and we should continue to Mirat Hashem to go in his ways, and to remember him only for good that he was, and only to give his shomanachas by being to megadol Torah, yagdol Torah la'adira, as I say. Thank you very much.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. Yasher Koyach, thank you, Rabbi Ullman, for those beautiful insights, and especially the personal ones, which are very impactful. And in addition to thanking, obviously, our three speakers who really gave us a window into the life of a real giant that many of us never had the zchus to meet. I'd also like to thank those of you who did make the time. I know it's middle of the afternoon; it's not an easy time. But thank you so much for joining us today. And of course, it's being recorded, and I'll make sure to give a copy to anyone who wants it. Thank you so much to everyone, and wishing you all the best. Kol tov. Thank you.
I just add something, Rabbi Ullman. I'd like to thank you, because for the Maisa that I told about the Chalitza took place 30 years ago. And so every now and then I wake up in the middle of the night and I think, did we really do the right thing? Because R Zalman Nechemia wouldn't put it in writing. And then I reasoned that this was Daka B'Kodesh. It didn't mean that he had any hesitation. So I thank you very much. I'll be able to sleep better from now on.
Maybe for the yard side, for the saying end of Kaddish, you should get a picture of the Tchelis.
I'll show it to Chaverim individually, but I don't think he'll be happy if I was
Individually, so we'll come around individually. You know, when somebody tells you something confidentially, you have to repeat it confidentially.
I thought you were going to say, can I show them some of the chubas that he wrote? Can you show me some of the things?
Nice it out, that's important.
Anyway, I want to thank everybody for coming today, and I feel better. I don't think that in any shape or form I gave him justice, but at least we did something lechvoidei. So, Yasher koach, everybody.
Yasher koach.
Rabbi Ullman, Rabbi Gudnik, and Rabbi Sabach. Thank you, Rabbi Glassman, for organizing the beautiful learning.
Thank
you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
It was unbelievable.
Hanukkah Sameach, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
And Rabbi Ullman,